Thank you once again for being Locked On Cougars, your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for being with us here on a Tuesday. If not a Tuesday, it's a Wednesday edition of the podcast. I'm recording it Tuesday night. My apologies for that. But BYU came up short in a tough loss to the Texas Tech Red Raiders last night in basketball. 72-67 is the final as BYU falls to 1-2 in conference and suffers their first home loss of the season. And it was a tough one to watch. I was there in the Marriott Center along with 17,000 of you. I think it was 17,703 was the announced attendance. Pretty good crowd for a Tuesday night and a pretty, I thought, crowd that was into it for the most part. But BYU, holy smokes, what happened? Because you watch this game play out. It was a back and forth affair for long stretches of this game. The lead for either team didn't get above 4 points. It had lead changes galore, tie game, back and forth all the way until about the 8-ish minute mark. And then all of a sudden, BYU, for whatever reason, and it's probably a credit to Texas Tech, started being unable to stop Texas Tech's offense. Now, a couple of big threes by Texas Tech's star shooter, Chance McMillan. That really kind of broke things open in favor of the Red Raiders. But then Darian Williams, what a man's game this guy put on down the stretch. He ends up with 18 points, 7-11 from the field, 2 of 4 from 3. But it felt like BYU just could not get this guy stopped. Now, I also look at it in certain circumstances, having watched that game with my own eyes, is the BYU felt like they could go out and hopefully stop him one-on-one. What did Texas Tech do? Well, Texas Tech got him in mismatches. And the thing is, he is an overpowering player and a really, really talented player to boot. And he put BYU in the proverbial blender on the low block. And he put Texas Tech on his back and said, boys, I'm carrying us to victory. Now, I mentioned Chance McMillan. He had 16 points. Also can't forget about Hawkins, who had 22, a really, really fine performance for him as he hit 6 threes in this game, scored 22, a game-high 22 points in the victory for Texas Tech. Tech showed that BYU still has a ways to go to become the team I think all of us, yours truly included, think that this BYU basketball squad can become. The number one glaring issue for me right now coming out of this game is what in the world is BYU's outside shooting and free throw shooting doing right now? 5 of 23 from the field overall from 3. And it's not like BYU was being run off the line and having to hoist up bad shots. There were a lot of good looks. And this is BYU's home court, speaking of the Marriott Center. And BYU could not buy a bucket. I think Kevin Young said it last night in postgame. They started 1 of 10 from 3. And he, along with and I think with every one of you within the sound of my voice, would have said you would never have guessed that BYU was going to start a game at home 1 of 10 from 3, but that was a reality. The other glaring issue, just 12 of 21 from the free throw line. In a 5-point loss, when you miss 9 free throws, yeah, that's a glaring issue. The other thing about this is I've had enough conversations with people, particularly when it comes to NBA potential, is a lot of teams will look at free throw percentages and free throw ability for athletes. And a lot of that correlates across with how good of a 3-point shooter they can become or are at the collegiate and hopefully at the next level, speaking of the NBA. BYU's collective inability to hit free throws in big circumstances, especially down the stretch in this game, absolutely crippled any opportunity they wanted to have to win this game. And it's one of those losses that you could look back on at the end of the season and say, what could have been had you pulled off that win? This BYU squad, if they want to go to the NCAA tournament, 500 in the Big 12 has kind of got to be the expectation. Right now, if you look at a lot of the projections for the NCAA tournament field, and let me caution you saying, hey, it's just 3 games in Big 12 play. There are 17 to go. So there's still a long runway here for BYU. But at the same time, projections from guys like Joe Lunardi have BYU among the first teams out. And having losses like this, even though Texas Tech, I think it's still a Q1 loss for BYU, it's one that was right there for the taking. The other issue, as I mentioned earlier, is that Darian Williams absolutely shredded BYU's defense down the stretch. If I'm not mistaken, and a couple of you, I think, tweeted at me, I think Rah Cougars was the first I saw. I think Texas Tech, correct me if I'm wrong here, went 11 of 15 from the field down the stretch. And if you're going to allow a team to essentially shoot 80+% against you in the final 15 possessions they have of a game, yeah, you're going to have a hard time winning that basketball game. And in many respects, the fact it was only a 5-point margin in the end is a credit to BYU, considering how poor that defense was down the stretch. There were stretches of this game early on that BYU went to the zone and really frustrated Texas Tech. And it took Tech a while to kind of solve what BYU was doing defensively. They didn't stay in a zone exclusively. They would switch to matchup zones. I saw some man-on-man type looks for BYU. But finally, Texas Tech essentially unlocked the BYU defense, and Kevin Young and company were unable to adjust on the fly to get BYU back into sets where they could have success defensively. Now, at the same time, when Tech started rolling there and started hitting shots, well, it's contagious. We all have seen it in college basketball. When teams start hitting shots, it feels like every guy on the roster suddenly can't miss. And I mentioned Chance McMillan. I think he was 0 of 3 before he hit his first of the 2 threes he made on the game. And both of those threes really kind of gave the momentum to Texas Tech. They seized it. I mentioned what Hawkins and Williams did down the stretch. They shredded BYU's defense. And that is a concern you've got to have if you're a Cougar fan as well, is the BYU's defense cannot falter in those moments. It's got to be better. These are back-to-back games, very different feelings coming out of them. Because remember, I did a postcast after the Houston game, and I felt like quite literally nothing. I mean, nothing went right for BYU in that game. In this game against Texas Tech, it's one of those woulda, coulda, shoulda games. It was right there for the taking. Houston, you got absolutely boat race. 31 points. Yeah, there's no woulda, coulda, shoulda in that circumstance. You got absolutely stomped on. This game, though, a 5-point margin on your home court, yeah, that's a tough one to stomach. And Kevin Young, he came into the post-game press conference. I know he comes off as very monotone and very measured with his comments, but I saw a little flash from him of that fire that I think drives him as a coach. He sat down to do his post-game press conference, and he had the box score folded up lengthwise. That's a hot dog style for those of you who are of a certain age in school. Maybe they still do that in the grade school. I'll have to ask my kids about that. But he like snapped it open and slapped it on the table. And the way he did it and kind of the glint in his eye at that moment, I'm like, all right, this dude's upset about this. And for good reason, because once again, that was a game that BYU very easily could have won. And had they been able to adjust a little more on the fly, maybe they could have pulled out that victory. I'm concerned, though, that when Darian Williams is chewing you up on the low block, why? Why, oh, why did BYU not double him and force the ball out of his hands? I saw the double a couple of times, but when he's rolling like he was, you have to force the ball out of his hands. Where is Fousseyni Traore? Where is Keba Keita? There was an and one, I think, all but sealed the win from Darian Williams, and it was Mawit Mag, guarding him one-on-one. And Mag, he may be the single best defender BYU has in terms of their ability to put one guy on the court and say, go shut somebody down. And he did his absolute darndest to slow down Darian Williams, but Williams, just this absolute Mack truck, went right through him, scores it, and one. Did miss the free throw, but BYU couldn't get the rebound on the ensuing miss, and that pretty much sealed up a win for Texas Tech. Why? Why was Fousseyni Traore not coming over at least to help defend him? Why were they not able to get a better defensive set in that circumstance? That, to me, screams that the coaching element needs to obviously answer for part of it, in addition to the players' inability to execute if they did have a coherent plan for how to get that ball out of his hands. It's a really, really tough loss to stomach, because I post Jimmer, Steve Pierce out there on social media. A few of you I saw. It was a game that was there for the taking for BYU. And there were stretches of this game you felt like, all right, BYU's in a good spot. But it felt like about 8 minutes to go, and Chance McMillan, I have to go back and look at the exact time. When he hit that first three, it was like, ooh, that's a momentum changer. And it absolutely flipped the momentum, and Texas Tech rode that wave all the way to the finish line and picked up a big win on the road. And they swept the double dip here in Utah. They smashed Utah on Saturday night, and they beat BYU. They're feeling good about themselves. They're back home in Lubbock, now getting ready for a massive showdown. They host Iowa State, number 3 Iowa State, on Saturday. Could Tech upend one of the premier teams, maybe the premier team in the league on Saturday? That remains to be determined. But BYU, now they have to turn their attention to TCU. What needs to change for BYU to have a chance to finally win on the road? Remember, they're 0-2 on the road so far this season. We'll delve into what from my vantage point, think BYU needs to focus on in the few days they have to prepare for TCU, and we'll delve into that next right here on Locked On Cougars. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. If you have not done so already, please sign up for the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Join us, get the inside scoop on all things BYU. I am hearing coming to your phone in the form of a text message. Have one-on-one conversations with myself and just support the podcast in general. The nice part is just $5 a month to be a part of the group. And more importantly, you get a 14-day free trial, a full 2 weeks before you pay anything to see if it's the right option for you. The link is in the show notes, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening it to wherever you get your podcast. Click the hyperlink in the show notes below. Join us today and be more in the know when it comes to BYU sports. All right. BYU now heads to TCU on Saturday. It's another noon Mountain Time start. It'll be 1 o'clock Central Time. The second time in 2 weeks that BYU is spending a Friday, Saturday down in Texas, this time in Fort Worth. And TCU is not the same caliber as Houston, but I can tell you the Horned Frogs, to use the expression, are licking their chops, considering a wounded BYU coming in to face them at TCU. TCU is a good team. Jamie Dixon has done a really, really fine job with the Horned Frogs because they were a laughingstock. They were very much a football school for a long stretch there before Jamie Dixon showed up and has transformed that TCU team into a very, very good basketball program. But BYU can't be thinking about anything other than we have got to go out there and get a win. BYU yacked away a major opportunity against Texas Tech. There's just zero doubt about that. It was I mentioned it, a woulda, coulda, shoulda moment for BYU basketball. What are you going to do now to get one back? Well, you need to go steal this one from TCU. And I think the level of play, speaking of the road games BYU's played to this point, of the 3 road games, obviously I'm including TCU upcoming, the BYU's played so far, TCU appears to be the most beatable of the trio. Providence and obviously Houston, those are really, really good squads, and BYU struggled against them. They have got to find a way, speaking of BYU, to find a way to get the ball to go in the basket, because beyond just the 3-point and free throw shooting woes, there were, I don't know how many bunnies, I like to use that term, shots in the paint that BYU couldn't get to go against Texas Tech. I would say it's double digits. If I went back and counted them up, I think it was in the double-digit territory of how many of those missed. BYU's simply got to find a way to generate A, offense on the road, and B, finish opportunities, create good shots, pass up good shots for great shots, tee up your teammates and give them an opportunity to lift this squad, because it's going to be obviously another hostile environment down there at TCU. Probably not to the same level as a Houston, even though Kevin Young didn't think it was that hostile, as he said. He said, I think there's just a really darn good basketball team, and he's got a good point there. But you're going on the road, and the evidence, as scanty as it is, just 2 road games so far this year, show that BYU has struggled mightily on the road. You've got to find a way to win on the road in this league. You've got to find a way to get yourself back to 500. You got to stay in the mix here for the NCAA tournament. And I do reiterate that BYU, this is just their 4th of 20 Big 12 games, but you've got to find a way to show that you can compete far better than you have at this point on the road. So A, shot making. Find a way to make shots, whether it's 3s or 2s. I don't care if it comes at the rim, in the mid-range, or from beyond the arc. Find a way to make shots and make them in bunches, because that's a major bugaboo for this BYU squad right now. Number 2, get back to being the dominant rebounding team that you were leading up to the Houston game. The last 2 games, 2 losses for BYU. They've lost the rebounding battle very decisively against Houston, a little narrower against Texas Tech. I think it was like 3 or 4 in the margin. It was 3, 39-36. But you still lost the rebounding margin, and more importantly, offensive rebounds you lost as well. Extra possessions generated by offensive rebounds have to be something BYU continues to focus on. So that's going to be an effort thing. Guys on the roster for BYU have got to bring the effort. And Kevin Young said he felt like there was an effort there put forth by BYU on the glass against Texas Tech, but he said just some unlucky breaks of the ball not landing or not getting into the hands of his players. You got to make a more concerted effort to win the rebounding battle. That's been a big key. Despite all the shooting woes BYU has struggled through at multiple points this season, getting extra possessions, getting extra looks has been kind of the lifeblood of this BYU basketball team, and you've got to get back to doing that. Number 3, can't have the defense get torn apart and not have an answer for it. That goes on the entire coaching staff, from Kevin Young to all of his assistants, to the analysts, the Nate Austin as their DBO, basketball ops guy. I don't care who you got to turn to. You've got to be able in the game when you start to see things falling apart, because That's the way it felt in many respects down the stretch against Texas Tech. When things are falling apart, you've got to be able to find a counter to the counter being thrown at you. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to use a lot of counters in the last 3 or 4 words, but the bigger point to be made is you have to be able to pivot and figure out things on the fly. I think Kevin Young is a very bright coach. I think some of his inexperience as being the guy, because the last time he was the guy was in the G League at the NBA level. And the G League is a developmental league, and you don't know quite literally sometimes your lineup till the day of games, just the nature of being coaching in that league. Now you're in a much more stable position. You have the 17 guys on your roster. You know who you have, who's at your disposal. Can you go out there and show progression as a coach, speaking of KYU, and show that you can make adjustments on the fly and get your players into positions where they're going to succeed and lead you to victory? That's a big question mark that still looms, I think, over Kevin Young. He's done an incredible job. Let me be very clear about this. He has done an incredible job elevating BYU basketball to a stratosphere that I didn't think BYU, quite frankly, could ever get to. They just landed the number 1 prospect in the entire country in AJ DeBonsa. Xavier Staten is moving to Utah Prep to play with AJ DeBonsa before they both enroll at BYU next year. They have done an incredible job acquiring talent to come into BYU basketball. Now, the next step is to round that talent into a cohesive unit that can go out there and win ball games. That, I think, is kind of the next step for Kevin Young to prove to us as a head coach. But it's also going to be incumbent on his players. I say this a lot. A lot of you rag on me for my support of guys like Aaron Roderick. Here's the deal. Coaches coach, players play. When players make plays and they execute the game plan their coach has for them, all of a sudden that coach looks absolutely brilliant. It's crazy how that happens, but that's the reality of things. Coaches can put their players in positions to succeed, and if those players execute said plans, everybody looks brilliant. When those players don't execute or things go awry or whatever, suddenly everybody looks like a complete dunce. And I know that's way too simplistic. I get that, but that's what it really boils down to. And I think that Kevin Young, he's got a brilliant basketball mind. You can tell he is always analyzing things, trying to get his guys into the best positions to succeed. But I once again, I think there's a bit of an inexperience factor that we're seeing at play with him early on in this Big 12 slate. The nice part is, as he's talked about it, and I think a number of others have talked about it, is still very early on. 3 games down, 17 to go. There is a long ways to go for BYU in this Big 12 slate. And the back half of the Big 12 slate, maybe the better half for BYU, based on the way things are projecting right now, because I think they're going to learn some tough lessons. And I think they've learned some tough ones the last 2 games in particular. Like I said, getting absolutely just blown away by Houston, and then a tough home loss to Texas Tech. Those are lessons that are going to benefit BYU down the road, but you can't wait too long. By the time we make the halfway turn, 10 games in, I think we're 2 or 3 weeks away from that. At that point, yeah, a lot of the quote inexperienced stuff, it's got to go away, and you've got to start to show progression. And that goes for the players, the coaches, everybody involved. But this TCU game in particular, yeah, focus on just making shots. Find a way to make them, whether it's free throw line, from beyond the arc, at the rim, make shots. Number 2, be able to go out there and dominate the glass like you have for long stretches of the season already. And then number 3, have ways to make changes on the fly that will benefit BYU and set them up to succeed. It seems like a pretty simple game plan, but this is a really, really tough league. And the book is being written on BYU just like it's being written on everybody else with regards to how to attack BYU. And I'm sure TCU will have a great game plan, but at the same time, I think BYU, they're ultra motivated to go out there and get back to 500 by stealing that game down there in Fort Worth. All right, we'll have more coverage of this coming up later this week. Also expected to catch up with Drake Toll from Locked On Big 12 for a crossover edition. And fingers crossed, been talking with Connor Pay. He's training for the NFL right now, but we may have found a window that we may be able to get a podcast with him and let you guys hear about how life post BYU is going for him as he prepares for his NFL career. We'll have that for you later in the week as well. Fingers crossed if all goes well. So that's it. That's what I got for you guys on this Wednesday edition of the show. As always, thank you for your support of the podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, share it with your family and friends. Do all the things out there that help this audience continue to grow. And as always, thank you for being everydayers with us here on the podcast. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day.